This time on Poll Hub, this coming Monday is Columbus Day, and it's Indigenous Peoples Day. Which do you celebrate? And is there room for both in an increasingly divided America? We're looking at the data. Then, what's in a word? Well, it turns out it matters quite a lot what that word is when it comes to immigration and what Americans think about it. We'll explain. And we finish with a fun fact that is only a few years old but feels oddly dated. And it makes us pretty hungry. Curious? Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho.
I'm Mary Griffiths.
And I'm Sylvia Weiser.
So Monday, this coming Monday, is Columbus Day. It's also Indigenous Peoples Day, and they fall on the same day because they are the same day, but they're seen in very different ways by different people. And we wanted to talk about that because it's a fairly recent thing. Columbus Day, when I was a kid, was a holiday. Got off from school and never had heard of Indigenous Peoples Day. Things have changed a lot in the last few decades, and these days are both on the same day, and they are subject of public opinion polling. There has been public opinion polls asking Americans about this, and let me give you some numbers, and then let's discuss this. What I'm interested in is how this is kind of seen through the lens of how we are reappraising our history in a lot of ways. But let's start with how people look at it now. This is from YouGov's survey last year. So last year when the holiday was coming, October 2024, 54% of Americans say Indigenous people are very important to U.S. history. And in that same poll, 55% said they had not heard much or nothing at all about Indigenous Peoples Day. Even so, when asked directly if they support it or not, majority said yes. So 54% in that poll approved celebrating it and combining both strongly and somewhat of approval, and 63% support federal recognition of it, 36% favor a full holiday with the day off, and 27% prefer a national observance without time off. So Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day do exist on the same day, and people may use them interchangeably. But there's still a long way to go before people, I think, from this poll, recognize that it exists. When you were a kid, Barb, I think you're like me, same era, Columbus Day was a holiday, but it wasn't one of the big holidays. At least that's my recollection. It does seem like it's gone through this lens, though, of how we've reappraised our history. And Columbus, while some Italians claim Columbus Day as their holiday, a lot of others see it as a day that Indigenous people should be recognized because of what Columbus did in coming to this country. Very complicated. There's a lot wrapped up in it.
Well, and also I think there's a lot of history that is also wrapped up in this. Having grown up in New York, where there was a very large and significant Italian community, Columbus Day was a very big deal. And it was, if we think in terms of federal holidays, Columbus Day is certainly one that is probably the youngest, one of the youngest holidays, because it was just recently, maybe in about not quite 50 years, made a federal holiday. In New York State, it was considered a holiday because of the large number of Italian Americans that lived here.
A big parade in Manhattan too, right?
Yeah, a big parade. It was a big celebration, but it harkens back not so much to, I think, the idea and what it has become today, where if there are Indigenous people who lived in the Americas, what exactly did Columbus discover? But this Columbus Day, I think, was initiated because there was an interest in identifying the importance that Italian Americans had in the history of the United States. We're going to talk a little bit in the second segment about immigrants and perceptions of immigrants more recently, but over time, there have always been kind of different waves of immigrants. And at the turn of the previous century, not the 2000s, but the 19th century, we had waves of immigrants from Italy. And if you think of the terms that people would use, the negative terms that people would use against immigrants now, the immigrants of that day were the ways of now Jewish Americans who were coming to the United States, the Irish who were coming to the United States, and also Italians who probably, I believe it was not until the 1950s, were considered people of color. So this really originates from the discrimination that many Italians had in this country during the first part of the 20th century. Certainly the discrimination, some internment, particularly of those who didn't have citizenship during World War II, because Italy was part of the Axis powers. And so the origination of Columbus Day was really more of a recognition that Italian Americans had a place in American history. And there's certainly a very different take on the holiday now. I think the polling certainly reflects that. And the people who support the recognition of Columbus or Indigenous Peoples Day is very much changing in terms of the generations.
Yeah, there's a big demographic shift in a College Pulse Newsweek poll in 2019. 79% of college students support replacing Columbus Day. And in a poll in 2020, College Fix, a College Pulse poll, 73% of students favor replacement. So this is like 5-6 years ago, but there does seem to be a generational thing. I'm just curious. Barb's point, I think, is really well taken. When you think about New York, growing up in New York, everybody's got a day, everybody's got a parade, right? You've got St. Patrick's Day, you've got Columbus Day, you've got the Puerto Rican Day parade, you've got days where your ethnicity you can do it. And this is seen, I think a lot of this is seen as a threat, at least by Italian Americans, as like a threat to them, right? As opposed to people who support Indigenous Peoples Day saying, no, but it's really about recognizing what happened when Columbus came here. It's not about Italians. How do you square that? And I mean, having grown up here with all of this kind of the ethnic stuff tied to these days, how do you square all that?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, you hit the nail right on the head where it's complicated, especially for someone like me who grew up in the southern part of New York, specifically in New York City, where there was the hubbub around the parade, and a person who is of Italian-American heritage. My last name would not give it away, but certainly my maiden name would, that I am of Italian descent. And I think the statistics regarding what younger Americans think is spot on. I do think that we have to move away to the idea of Indigenous Peoples Day. So here, I think there can be some compromise here where you can recognize the heritage of Italian Americans and respect the accomplishment in the most basic sense of being able to take the journey, take the expedition that Columbus did, find new land, but at the same time, not condoning the horrendous behavior. So it is complicated, but I do think that to some extent that we need to move away from the idea of Columbus Day toward Indigenous Peoples Day, recognizing both sides and honoring that. And, look, I mean, as a kid, I loved having Columbus Day off. My children have Columbus Day off. It's a nice day to have off to honor whatever side of the aisle that you stand on. But it is a day to reflect on the history and the culture of, as Barb pointed out, not just Italian Americans, but also of being American and what that means and how that has evolved over the centuries.
Yeah, I wonder, Barb, is like Mary talks about a compromise. Is there a space here to talk about the accomplishments of Italian Americans and not link them to a guy, Columbus, who happens to be Italian, although he was sponsored in his journeys by a different country in Europe at the time? But is there a way to kind of separate the pride of all that Italian Americans have accomplished here from one guy, Columbus, and at the same time recognize Indigenous people and what they suffered at the hands of not just Columbus, but a lot of the European conquerors?
Well, I think this really speaks to how do we really balance each person's identity and ethnic heritage, which with the fact that we are a unique and separate country from the places from all of our ancestors came from. Even you, Jay, who came over, whose family came over on the Mayflower.
Well, not literally. Yeah. The next boat. Yeah.
Most of us have gotten here in one way or another because the United States has been built by the fact that we are a country of immigrants and people who have mostly come from other places. So I think your point here is really well taken. How do we as a country recognize different ethnicities and celebrate these different ethnicities without then feeling that we are taking something away from either the history of other people or for the importance of the role that each of us, each of our ancestors has played in the development of this country. Recognize that it's also a question as to why Columbus and his crew headed out at that particular time, because that was not a calm time period in Europe. In fact, 1492, although we learned that it was in school that this was the time when Europeans landed on the shores of the Americas. In 1492 in Europe, that has a very different meaning, because that is really the formalizing of the Inquisition and the expulsion of Jews from many countries, Jews and Muslims, I should note, and the focus on making those countries Christian nations. So when you say it's complicated, it is incredibly complicated. And I think to the degree that we can talk about history and we can talk about that many people, despite how they may feel that their standing is at any one point in time, we've all gotten here, in a sense, for many of the same reasons, because of the fact that the United States has been a place where people have been able to live their lives regardless of their ethnic background and regardless of their religious beliefs. So that may be something that we want to take away from this discussion of Columbus Day, and how do we make sure that we are reminded of that history and how we maintain that tolerance going forward.
Well, I think given the proportion of college students who feel that replacing Columbus Day with Indigenous People Day is appropriate, I think this may be a question for the next generation of voters as they become a larger share of the electorate to really resolve this and figure out a way to honor Americans' heritage, regardless of what that is.
So historically, immigration has been celebrated as a founding principle of the United States. But as we've just discussed, this can be a very complicated issue. I'd like to bring in Sylvia Weiser, one of our student producers, who decided to take on the issue of immigration as one of our topics. Welcome, Sylvia. Tell me, why did you decide to take a look at this particular issue, and tell me the piece of it that you found most fascinating?
Hi, Barb. Yeah, so I'm interested in public perception about immigration. We're kind of seeing a lot of different thoughts and opinions kind of emerge about this. And so when I looked at the data, something that I found really interesting is that when we ask people about what their thoughts are on immigration, depending on how you ask it, it seems like we're getting different answers. So some data that I found that was interesting was that US adults are more likely to express unfavorable opinions about illegal immigrants and about undocumented immigrants than about immigrants as a whole. So in a poll, 22% have an unfavorable of just immigrants, and 38% have an unfavorable opinion of illegal immigrants, and 39% have an unfavorable opinion of undocumented immigrants, which seems to run counter to the argument that the term illegal immigrant incites anti-immigrant prejudices. So I'm just kind of wondering, what are your thoughts on this, and how do you think, in general, the wording of a question impacts how people respond to the question?
Well, certainly we know that question wording does matter. I mean, we see that in our conversations. We see that in our debate and dialogue about different policies and different issues. We need, as pollsters, to certainly be very sensitive to those things. And I think your research is particularly interesting because there has been a significant discussion about whether the use of illegal or undocumented makes a difference in how people respond to the question. And I think that data that you found, that's not really the crux of the issue. In this particular instance, the language doesn't matter in the sense that people understand it to be perhaps immigrants that did not go through the appropriate process to come here. So whether we use the word illegal or we use the word undocumented, it certainly has a connotation that somehow the process was circumvented and that people have gotten here without going through the proper channels. And I found that to be fascinating because certainly that has been part of the debate and the language. I also found the information that you collected on just immigrants in general really support this idea and this value that Americans have about immigrants in this country. I think we've gotten to a point where we are incredibly polarized about the debate. But when you do look at the data, only 22% of Americans have an unfavorable opinion of immigrants. Most Americans, when we have also asked questions about this, believe that immigrants are very important to the United States. But I think the issue certainly changes when we look at two other aspects of this. One being the path by which they came to this country and whether they followed proper channels. And the second being, I think a lot of the policy that we're seeing right now with regard to ICE and the up of immigrants who have not come here legally. There are very different opinions depending upon which side of the political aisle you sit.
So yeah, I'm curious because one of the numbers that you found here that strikes me as being very interesting and kind of runs counter to the narrative is from a Gallup poll this summer. And Americans just in general are asked, are immigrants generally a good thing or a bad thing for the country? It's a record high, 79%. They ask this question over time, right? It's a trend. 79% of U.S. adults say it's a good thing. This summer, in the summer of 2025, were you surprised by that based on how immigration has become arguably the central flashpoint in American politics?
Yeah, I absolutely was surprised by that, especially because that number includes 91% of Democrats and 80% independents and then 64% Republicans, which I think because of how polarized the issue has become, I was not thinking that that was going to be the data that was shown. On the other hand, I think when you look at in terms of like policy such as Border Patrol, that was a little bit more kind of along the lines of what I was anticipating from looking at the data, where in terms of the partisanship, so support for Border Patrol agents has kind of stayed the same among Republicans at about 90%, and support has plummeted among independents from 69% to 53%, and then Democrats from 70% to 41%, which is kind of more aligned with what I was anticipating.
When you talk to your fellow students, and granted, this is we're on a campus with students who are getting a liberal arts education and they come from various areas, but there are plenty of kids on campus here who have immigrant backgrounds. What is your sense about how you're not wholly, you don't need to speak for your entire generation, but the people that you talk with, how are they viewing what's going on with immigration right now? And does it kind of align with this 79% of U.S. adults who actually think immigration is a good thing?
It's super interesting to consider that, especially just because of the type of demographic that Marist has. So along a lot of my peers, I think the narratives that they are believing and that they understand comes from their parents in general. So if their parents feel like this immigration is a threat to them, then my peers are also going to similarly feel it and see it as a threat. Whereas if their parents are more open to the ideas of immigration and kind of making things a little bit more easier to like gain citizenship, they're going to be more open to that. But my peers will be more open to that as well. So one thing that I've noticed in conversation actually is that the kind of general consensus among my peers is, oh, well, if they're coming in and they're following all the processes, then they should be here. And then the idea is that, well, if they're not following the documentation processes and all those sorts of things, then they shouldn't be here. So it seems a little bit black and white among my peers right now.
I think what's important also to point out is that generally speaking, immigration is really considered to be broadly a net positive in the United States. And I think, Sylvia, you make a good point that the issue is really when we see a very strong consensus among Americans to allow people to enter this country. It has been part of the American tradition. But I think that particularly over the last couple of decades, I think there has been a good deal of confusion and concern about what that immigration process is and how to monitor it and how to deal with it.
So we're going to take a sharp turn now and turn to our fun fact. Lee is not with us today, so I have some pretty big shoes to fill. But we're asking the question, what is your favorite takeout food? And we have the results of a CBS News poll from 2019. And this is probably not going to surprise a lot of people, but pizza took the top spot, followed by Chinese food and Mexican food. Fried chicken followed, and burgers rounded out the top 5 responses. So I am going to open this up immediately. My answer would be yes, please.
Especially now we're recording at lunchtime and we haven't eaten. So yes, please.
And it makes it so easy, especially living in New York City. But I will hold off on weighing in on my top choice. AJ, why don't you jump in? So we haven't heard from you yet this podcast. What is your favorite takeout food?
Okay, I will say Chinese, probably a classic. I like pizza, but it wouldn't be my go-to choice. And also, do we think delivery counts as takeout?
Absolutely.
But that's
Okay,
a good point, AJ, because I'm looking at burgers and I'm thinking, that's takeout. That ain't delivery. Oh, the bun gets all soggy, right? That's what I was thinking.
There's a difference, I think, a little bit maybe. And usually I get delivery, so that will affect my choice. But that's my opinion.
So what about you, Sylvia? Do you have a preference?
Also going to have to side on Chinese food because in my thought process is that if I'm getting takeout, I don't want to cook. I can cook a pizza. I could cook frozen pizza in the oven.
Frozen pizza. I love it, Sylvia.
Well, I wonder how much of this, though, has changed even in the 6 years since this question was asked. Because if you live in an area where you have a whole host of restaurants, you're actually not limited anymore because of the fact that the delivery services are ubiquitous. And you can pretty much order in from any of your favorite restaurants. So I just found the fact that this question, usually when students are looking in the question archives, we're going back decades and decades, and we're kind of observing how language has changed and how we discuss things has changed. But I was kind of surprised that this question doesn't feel as applicable right now to me as it might have just a few years ago. I will hop on the Chinese bandwagon, the Chinese food bandwagon here too. For the same reason Jay wouldn't do a takeout burger. It doesn't quite taste the same by the time you get it home. And pizza is fun, but actually kind of feel a bit decadent if you do it too often.
Oh, well, Barb, I have to say it. I'm going to bring Jay in just a moment. I'm holding off for a reason. But I love pizza. Pizza, I could eat it every day, but especially living where I live, there are different types. There's upside down, there's Sicilian,
What's
there's
upside down pizza?
Upside down pizza is usually thick crust and the sauce and the cheese are flipped. And you'd be surprised. It's quite enjoyable.
The sauce is on top. No,
Yes.
the cheese. Wait,
The sauce is on top of the cheese. Yes, the sauce is on top of the cheese.
Completely confused. I didn't think I could ever be confused by pizza, and you just completely confused me.
It's called
Upside down pizza.
soto. I'm going to mess it up, and I say it all the time. Soto presso. I think it is a soto sopro, and it is.
I like the accent, Mary.
Yeah, that was good.
It took me a while to get there.
You just proved that from the last segment, the Italian roots thing, right? So there you go.
Well, I will betray my Italian roots because I love Mexican takeout too. That's probably my second. I absolutely love Mexican takeout. But Jay, you lived in Lower Manhattan for a very long time, and I know that there are fantastic takeout places there. Did you have a favorite?
Actually, Thai, which is not on here, and that was probably and to that day now, even in Brooklyn, when we're in Brooklyn, we do order in, and we order in Thai. There's 3 things about this that are fascinating. One is what AJ brought up, which is this idea of, well, takeout is different than delivery. The second is what Barb brought up, which is 2019 isn't that long ago, and yet COVID and Uber Eats and all the delivery services rendered this somewhat like an old question, even though it's from 2019. And the third thing is that when you look at this and you ask this question of people, how is mac and cheese on this list? I don't understand. Mac and cheese either as delivery or as takeout. Mac and cheese.
Well, you know what?
That baffles me. I don't get that one. I don't get it.
If you have kids, you'd actually be surprised by that because more often than not, say if we order in from a diner, My littlest one will request mac and cheese, and that is what she
All right.
likes for
All
takeout.
right. Yeah, you're right. I don't have kids, and that's probably why.
And it wasn't mentioned, but it was 3% of the responses to this question.
So regardless of what your takeout choice is tonight, think of us, and we hope you'll join us next week.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week.
Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers,
Cassie Connors, Sylvia Weiser, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.